How is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, earth-shattering discoveries, magnum opuses, and tour de forces, mostly emanating from obscure sources. Today is our 248th Bible Decode, coming from the New Testament, and we've been exploring the Roman origins hypothesis, which is an obscure, still obscure point of view, but many authors are going at it with that theory because of its great explanatory power and its basic common sense, especially nowadays when people are more familiar with psychological operations and conspiracy theories, and how they are generally correct. The CIA coined the term conspiracy theory to marginalize anybody who wasn't with the program, but that was a long time ago, in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. And people are smart enough now that they've figured out that when you call something a conspiracy theory, that most likely means that it's correct, because somebody is trying to get you off the track. Anyway, the Roman origins hypothesis is basically that the New Testament was written by the Romans, by the Caesars, as part of a psychological operation. The New Testament was a psyop from the Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty from 69 until 96 AD. That's Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. They wrote the New Testament and backdated the story by 40 years. At the same time, they wrote a history of a war that Vespasian and Titus were veterans of, which is the war between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. This came out in 7 volumes. It's called War of the Jews, written under the name of Josephus, Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian family. And if you read his autobiography, he says that he was a Jew fighting in this war against the Romans, but then eventually surrendered to Emperor Vespasian, or General Vespasian at the time, and had an epiphany that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans, predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor. And when Vespasian did become emperor, he pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome, made him one of the court historians, put him up at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family, if you can believe that. Which hopefully you can't. So then you would recognize that Josephus is either a fake person, an amalgam of persons, a pen name, or something to that effect. But regardless, he emanates from Rome. So that 7-volume work, War of the Jews, when read in conjunction with the New Testament, shows you many, many parallels between the two, such that whoever wrote the New Testament was the author of whoever wrote War of the Jews. So we know War of the Jews was coming from the Romans, and the New Testament was written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. Michael Menescot's in his book, Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, found over 250 parallels between War of the Jews and just the book of Luke. And Joseph Atwill, in his book, Caesar's Messiah, found over 40 separate events where the ministry of Jesus is a replica of the military campaign of Titus. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each location that are spaced out by 40 years, often to the hour. So, this goes way beyond coincidence, and it's just a drop in the bucket of the evidence. Obviously, the Romans had a motive, which was to mellow out the Jews, who they had gotten very tired of all of the uprisings and revolutions and wars and assassinations and terrorist attacks and so on and so forth that the Jews had been, doing to the Romans for over 100 years. Vespasian and Titus, as veterans of that war, were both wounded. And so they, even though they decimated the Jews in the end, they knew that the Jews were coming back resilient because they had been doing that for over 100 years. And so they wanted to, they also knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, a military leader who would help them overthrow the Romans. So instead, the Romans wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a prince of peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, concluding that the Roman centurion slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and at the same time taking direct aim at the Jewish traditions and the Jewish people, overturning the tables of the money changers at the temple, and cursing out the Jews, the merchants who were selling small animals at the temple, and completely foregoing the idea of Jewish family values, then when you go further into the New Testament, into the Pauline material, you discover that Paul is even more pro-Roman and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. Almost as if these, people were created by the Romans for this very purpose. Now, there is a hell of a lot of more evidence, circumstantial and direct, that you can get from watching, most any of my previous Bible decodes on this channel. But right now we're reading from a book, we're getting to the conclusion here, from Rosemary Sheldon and Thies Voskuilen, which is called Operation Messiah. And this book is a limited form of the Roman origins hypothesis, in that they don't really apply the standard to Jesus, but they do apply the standard to Paul. They recognize that Paul's behavior is almost cartoonish in its, even before the invention of cartoons, in its, just massive pro-Romanism and anti-Jewism. So they don't apply the same standards to Jesus. They make some distinctions that are hardly differences. It, adversely affects their analysis. But nonetheless, they do come to that same conclusion with Paul and make an interesting case. So this conclusion starts with a section that's called Paul of Tarsus, Agent Provocateur. The case at hand offers an interesting question with regard to the matter of proof. In intelligence work, you cannot prove a spy is guilty unless an agent is caught in the act, admits to the crime, or has his cover blown. This is impossible with Saul, just as it is impossible to prove that he was a saint. A modern-day intelligence officer searching for an undercover agent will study a person's profile, motives, and actions. Then he or she will put together a picture through logic and intuition that suggests what that person is up to. We are the first to admit, they wrote this back in, I think, 2006 or 7. We are the first to admit that there is very little positive evidence to prove conclusively that Paul was a spy. But we must also conclude that there is very little positive evidence to prove that Paul was a Pharisee, or a Jew, or a Roman citizen, or a man of high social standing, or a man born in Tarsus or Jerusalem, or a man who was martyred in Rome. Can we say without a reasonable doubt that Paul was sincere about his so-called conversion? In the end, we may know absolutely nothing about the man we call Paul. Like many a modern lawyer, we cannot prove our case conclusively, but we can certainly create a reasonable doubt about the traditional story. For that matter, there is no scholarly consensus about what the traditional story really is among those who have spent lifetimes studying Paul. An interpretation must be judged by the number of oddities it explains. And that's why you go with the Roman origins hypothesis for the entire New Testament, not just for Paul. So we believe the provocateur interpretation explains a large number of these oddities more satisfactorily than the saint theory. But the Roman origin hypothesis explains even more of those oddities. And we'll probably see a residue of the oddities that they leave behind that will be handled by the Roman origins hypothesis. In fact, many of the traditional problems seem to disappear. Why did the high priest never react to Paul's defection? Why did his fellow persecutors on the mission to Damascus allow Paul to desert? And why did they assist him in contacting the enemy? Because it's all fiction. Why was Paul, this is very blurry here, why was Paul so comfortable in Roman circles? Why was Paul never treated as a real dissident? Why did the Nazarenes consider him an enemy? And why are they trying to kill him? What did Paul really do in Rome? The scholar who said that it is impossible to be neutral about Paul was correct. Paul is a man who has been reviled and revered ever since his appearance on the historical scene. A well-known scholar has written that Paul has been called by many names, most of them nasty. So who is this Paul, and why is he so controversial? Why would a preacher and teacher of the Christian gospel find himself in such constant trouble? It has been pointed out that it was not even necessary for Paul to be in a given city to generate anti-Pauline activity. Why was Paul considered a threat to the apostles in Jerusalem? Why would he, a Roman, be detained so often and for so long by the Roman establishment? Many people have noticed Paul's strange behavior and personality before, and they have attributed it to many different motivations. Could part of the explanation have been the line of work Saul went into in Jerusalem? There is a need to explain what has been called Paul's dissonance-laden status. That is, Paul frequently suffers in ways that could have been totally avoided. According to the account in Acts, he experienced disadvantages in deliberations and endured harsher penalties than necessary whenever litigants and officials judged him to be of lower status than he actually was. Was this the result of a desire to be martyred? Was Paul a masochist, or did he just need to maintain a cover story? Any of these explanations is plausible. Some have blamed Paul's behavior entirely on his personality. Paul tried to change every group he joined and every idea he embraced. Some have suggested that his ego and volatile temperament drove his career rather than any theological idea. Other scholars have suggested that Paul led a double life for reasons concerning his sexual orientation, not his employment. We have suggested it was his profession, pretending to be a Nazarene, while actually being an agent provocateur for the Romans. This interpretation assumes continuity in both his professional and personal life, not a radical and all too sudden change in character, political loyalties, and spiritual convictions. In the traditional version of the story, both Paul's actions and those of his colleagues are highly unlikely from a strategic and psychological point of view. Theological discussions do not have to rely on logic, but historical discussions do. Even Paul's own letters contain starkly negative sketches of himself as a weak, uncharismatic, dishonest, self-serving, unimposing interloper in the apostolic circle. Those writers who have focused on the negative side of Paul's character portray him in turn as a misogynist, a friend of repression and superstition, and as dogmatic antithesis of Jesus. One author even accuses him of wanting to be the Messiah himself. To others, Paul appears to act like a chameleon. He is more Jewish than the Jews, more Roman than the Romans, proud both ways, full of startling confessions and self-revelations that would not surprise us if they were slipped into the pages of Nietzsche. Ironically, Nietzsche himself leveled the greatest broadside of all against Paul when he accused him of perverting Christianity and perpetuating it on the world as a hoax. In comparison, our contention that he might have connections with Roman intelligence seems almost complimentary. This section is called How We Ascertain the Facts. The main difficulty in assessing Paul's actions and personality is the relative paucity of reliable sources. I would just say you ain't seen nothing yet because you're still using Josephus and the New Testament as reliable sources. But when you realize that they're both psyops, then you have even more of a paucity of reliable sources. Our view of Paul, as everyone else's, must be based on the book of Acts and the Pauline epistles. All else is much later speculative commentary. The problem is that these two sources are contradictory and of questionable historical reliability. Too often, scholars have tried to harmonize these two very different versions of Paul's story, even though this is not standard academic practice at all when historical sources are incompatible. Normally, one would have to be discarded as less credible than the other. In the case of Acts and Paul's letters, of course, this would mean the end of either Acts or of Paul's letters. Both scenarios would be the end of Christianity as we know it. So instead, the two incompatible sources are harmonized. This creates a sort of third narrative that then becomes received wisdom. Part of the reason for this is, of course, an extension of the church's need to create doctrinal harmony. While doing so, scholars do not always seem to use reliability of the sources as the ultimate yardstick, but availability. One scholar has compared this phenomenon to a man who is looking for missing car keys. A man with drink taken revolves slowly around a mercury vapor lamp in a near empty parking lot. In the orange light, he searches for something on the ground. Lost your keys? Yes. Where's your car? Over there. He gestures towards a vehicle 40 meters away. Why not look over there? Because the light's better here. Another reason, however, may be that there is a Paul behind this process whom no one wants to see or consider. The book of Acts has been judged by many scholars to be, at best, an impoverished historical record of the events it seeks to describe, and at worst, a work of fiction. Ding, 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 ding. Neither Paul's letters nor Acts can be taken as history in the modern sense of the word, because they were written as theological texts meant to be used by a faith community, or perhaps as fiction to be used as a psychological operation against a faith community. They are works of theological justification, often at odds with each other, and for many, very little in the way of meaningful chronology or historical accuracy can be obtained from them. One scholar describes Paul's writings as notoriously jagged, full of metaphors that fly right out of the frame of discussion, packed with contradictions of his own arguments and mixed with analogies that backfire. Even if Acts were accurate, it is still an ideological product, as are all historical narratives, ancient and modern. The ideology of its author shapes, colors, or exaggerates the events and characters. Paul was in a constant state of explaining away his behavior, justifying his claim to apostleship, covering up his tracks, or perhaps just maintaining his cover. The great divide comes between Christian scholars who accept these documents at face value and those who view them with a more critical eye. In dealing with Paul, Christians cannot help but presuppose that Paul's message and theology are basically true, even if scholars must perform a little critical surgery here and there. Paul's writings are the church's earliest literary foundation, and this creates, at the very least, an implicit Paulinist bias. Now, a lot of the people that push the Roman origins hypothesis would claim that the Pauline epistles are not earlier than the Gospels, but rather later, written between 100 and 110 AD approximately, and written primarily by Flavians, including, the brother of Arius Piso, who was kind of a cousin of the Flavians, the younger foster brother who is known as Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger has a long set of epistles that he wrote himself that I think can be used to parallel a lot of the Pauline epistles written at the same time. And so the only evidence that I ever see cited for the reason why the Pauline epistles are dated earlier than the Gospels is because Paul had ample opportunities to cite the Gospels and never does. and where the Gospels would strengthen his points, the points that he makes, but he never does. And so they basically are assuming that the Pauline epistles were earlier, and so he couldn't have cited them because they hadn't been written yet. As one white writer pointed out, too many scholars use theological abstractions as the engine of the train and not its epiphenomenal rhetorical caboose. It was for this reason that the hypercritical scholars of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had to be diverted or refuted, because their work would have led Pauline scholars down a road which they could never travel unless they wanted to undermine the very foundation of their own faith. The fact has driven much of Pauline scholarship in the late 20th century and early 21st century. More recent scholars have gone as far as privileging the letters over Acts or the Hauptbriefe over the pastoral letters. But they must all stop short of removing these essential touchstones of the faith, or they will bring down the wrath of the biblical establishment upon themselves. So, for example, the tightly argued chronology set up by John Knox's Chapters in the Life of Paul is based on the assumption that the statements in the letters are true, even though that assumption has been questioned. And E.P. Sanders, who admits in Paul, the law, and the Jewish people, that Paul's arguments are usually a mass of inconsistent rationalizations, still grants priority to the conversion experience which he assumes underlies them. We believe that the historicity of all of Paul's autobiographical statements must be questioned, for the very simple reason that as a persecutor, he may have had an excellent professional motive to lie about them. As the eminent Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen has written, although one may have personal faith, one must write as an atheist. We must address Paul's world in wholly material and intellectual terms. We have divorced ourselves completely from the Pauline cheerleading team and looked at things from another perspective, a cold, hard analysis of the cynical realities of Roman imperial intelligence work. Now, they have divorced themselves from the Pauline cheerleading team, but they have not so much divorced themselves from the Jesus cheerleading team. Now, they don't overtly go out there and cheerlead for Jesus, only on a couple of occasions, but they certainly haven't divorced themselves. This may well have been the kind of analysis Saul himself undertook when he was a persecutor. Our interpretation may be exactly the point of view Saul had on the road to Damascus. Undercover work can just as easily explain his experience as the conversion scenario, and frankly, this sort of thing happened more frequently than Jesus' appearing to people out of nowhere. Furthermore, our explanation is a rational one, not a supernatural one. That explains the change in Paul's identity and behavior. Adherence to Paul's writing seems natural, since Paul's outlook dominated and shaped the perspective of the Gospels. The Paulinist view of what Jesus' ministry had been about became triumphant in the church as it developed in history. Rival interpretations that were opposed to Paul's new and radical view became heretical. They were crowded out of the final version of the writings adopted by the Pauline Church as the inspired canon of the New Testament. Many of the later documents written by Christians and non-Christians were generated by groups that either turned Paul into a saint or reviled him as a heretic or a devil. For us, this has meant finding a way to crack the codes of theological disinformation and listening to the long-faded echoes of history's losers. We have tried to give them a voice. We do not know what Jesus himself would have thought of Paul, although Martin Scorsese created an interesting apocryphal meeting between them in The Last Temptation of Christ. Paul comes across as little better than a snake oil salesman. To the best of our knowledge, such a meeting never took place, and the disciples who knew Jesus best left no record behind to explain how Jesus seemed to them or what they considered his mission to have been. We are left with Acts, which is simply an extended ideological message. Its goal is to show that Paul was a leading figure in the expansion of the faith after the death of Jesus, and later Christian writings attempted to minimize evidence of the vitriolic splits among various branches of the early Jesus movement. They did this by glossing over the split between Paul and James. Yet even the evidence of Acts cannot cover up all the hostility. Entire books have been written on the anti-Paulinism of the relatives of Jesus. Okay, that's the end of that section. We'll start tomorrow with this section called Hostility. And thanks for tuning in today. Hope you come back tomorrow to hear more about Paul and Jesus on our 249th Bible Decode. And in the meantime, like, share, and subscribe. Comment as you see fit, and have a wonderful day.